Thank you for joining us for our roundtable on racial social democracy, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal in dialogue with contemporaneous political economic thinkers. So we are three roundtable participants. The first that I'll introduce is Professor Gerald Jaynes. He is the A. Whitney Griswold Professor of Economics, African American Studies, and Urban Studies at Yale University. He earned the doctorate in economics from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana in 1976. He is recognized as an expert on race relations and the economic conditions of African Americans and has lectured and spoken on these topics at many universities and forums around the world. His research has been cited internationally within forums such as legislative bodies and courts, including the US Supreme Court. Among his most notable publications are A Common Destiny, Blacks in American Society, 1989. Branches Without Roots, Genesis of the Black Working Class in the American South, 1986. Immigration and Race, New Challenges for American Democracy, 2000. And the Encyclopedia of African American Society, 2004. Next, I will introduce, by the way, Michael, can you correct my pronunciation of your last name?
Okay, McEachrane.
McEachrane. Thank you. Dr. Michael McEachrane is a prominent voice in Black European studies and a seasoned international advocate for the human rights of people of African descent at the European Union and United Nations. He is the editor of Afro-Nordic Landscapes, Equality and Race in Northern Europe, 2014, and author of Universal Human Rights and the Coloniality of Race in Sweden, 2018. He has a PhD in philosophy from Åbo Akademi University in Finland. And myself, I am a historian of US philanthropy and the social sciences and founding executive director of the Miami Institute for the Social Sciences, established in June 2020 to center and amplify the scientific output of global majority scholars across the global South and North. My book, White Philanthropy, Kearney Corporations and American Dilemma and the Making of a White World Order, is forthcoming with the University of North Carolina Press this October. Okay, so I'll get us started. You know, we have a roadmap, everyone, so we have a general sense of our conversation, though it would be relatively informal as we share knowledge and push each other on these topics. So we thought of starting with introductions on the Myrdals in Sweden, the US, and on the global stage. So first, Professor Jaynes will speak a bit on Gunnar Myrdal in 20th and 21st century US and the global stage. And then I will speak a bit on the Myrdals in the US and then Sweden and the global stage, and then Michael too. So with that overlap, you can start, Professor Jaynes.
Well, good afternoon. I would start this off by saying, when I was 13, which was quite a while ago, I happened to be next door to my parents' home, and which was my aunt and uncle, but I was foraging through a shed that they had in the backyard, and I came upon several boxes of books, and I started rummaging through these boxes and pulled out this big, thick tome, which turns out, I looked at the title, An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. So, you know, 13, this is 1960. So that's a big deal because, you know, still basically in the Jim Crow era, although I was in Northern Illinois and wasn't dealing with much of that. But still, it struck me. So I took that, went to my room, started reading. So that's my introduction to Myrdal. And I was kind of fascinated with what I could understand. And I start out with that preface to say the following, that I think that I'm now kind of a minority. So this is like age cohorts and generations. I'm kind of a minority on what my view of Myrdal is, which I think obviously is a more accurate view than younger people, because I think they're being anachronistic. But I can understand that because it's difficult to have, I don't know, been raised during the 1990s or even the 1980s and have a really good grasp on what it was like to be an African American, or for that matter, what it was like to be any kind of an American living, let's say, in the 1950s, much less what it would have been like when Myrdal arrived in the United States in the 1930s, right in the midst of Jim Crow's too nice a word to describe that apartheid situation and the horrendous treatment that all people of color, but particularly African Americans, were undergoing. So then the issue for me then becomes the following. If you read Myrdal, how do you understand an American dilemma first? You have to, I think, understand it in the following context. It's supposed to be a piece of scholarship, the best possible you could get in the late 1930s, early 40s. But secondly, it's supposed to persuade. And that's maybe even more important than the scholarship. It's supposed to persuade. Persuade who? Well, it doesn't have to persuade Black people, and it doesn't have to persuade liberal whites who may have been attuned to being part of the nascent part of the civil rights movement, which is already sort of fomenting, certainly at this time. It's to persuade, and it's not going to persuade, obviously, completely recalcitrant segregationists somewhere in Mississippi or North Carolina or Texas, wherever they might be. But there's a whole lot of white people who weren't completely recalcitrant, who were going along with Jim Crow race relations, who might be persuaded to tone down how they felt about the Negro problem. So that's the audience. And as soon as one understands that is the audience, you can then understand some of the strategies involved in how the work is written. Right? So some of the things that get criticized today, there's an intentionality, I think, in Myrdal's strategy of writing this, So let's go at the first attack on American dilemma. What's that first? Why this white guy from Sweden? Well, if we go back to it's supposed to persuade, who else? You're not persuading those people with any Black scholar, certainly, no matter how great that scholar might be. And the idea that you could try to find some white scholar who had a certain level of distance from the problem in the United States was also going to be helpful towards the Black audience. So my own view on that is the Carnegie Corporation they did pretty much what they should have done. Myrdal also had a very strong international reputation. So they knew that they were getting a first-rate scholar. They got someone who was willing to work with the legions of African-American scholars who were available and whose work he relied on so much. And I know Maribel can talk about that for a bit. But despite the fact that we can criticize that it's known as the Myrdal study, even though we know hundreds and hundreds of pages, thousands of pages were done by a very large group of individuals like Ralph Bunche, and the work of other scholars, clearly Du Bois, E. Franklin Frazier, and other individuals were indispensable in what Myrdal was able to do in that short length of time. Now, how did he approach the issue? Well, I thought that he did a pretty good job of how he would approach the issue. He met with pretty much all the people he should have met with, immersed himself in the literature that was available, and sat down and began to write. Now, there's a lot of things we can criticize, and I'm going to have something to say about what my major criticism would be a little later. But Myrdal brought to this issue the sort of systematic thinking that was only available during the 1930s by the new group of economists that were working on an international scale. And that new group of economists were mostly based in England, and quite surprisingly, and I'm going to stop shortly, but quite surprisingly in Scandinavia, and particularly in Sweden. So the Myrdal was the inheritor and participant of a truly strong heritage of economics that came from what is not known in economics as the Stockholm School. And sort of the grandfather of that group was Knut Wicksell, who was a progenitor of John Maynard Keynes, who in one sense started modern macro and international economics. But there were also individuals like Eric Lindahl and Olin. Then I was surprised to find out Dag Hammerschmidt, who not until somewhat recently did I know was actually an economist, but I knew that name because when I was a boy of about 10, Dag Hammerschmidt was the Secretary General of the United Nations. So I knew that name very well because I'm old enough back then when you went to the movies, they had those newsreels, right? And you guys don't know about newsreels probably, but all movies were double features back in those days. And between the features, they'd have this news show that would go on, and they'd have all kinds of world events that they would highlight. And often they would do stuff on the United Nations, and there'd be Dag Hammerschmidt. Right? So these two groups took it upon themselves to do two things: to reorient the way economists and therefore also social scientists thought about economic systems. And that's what led to the modern formulations of economics and development economics through a thing called growth theory. But Myrdal had written a book on monetary economics prior to coming to the United States. So he knew about writing about mathematical systems and expositing them without using the math. And he was excellent at that. Everybody can't do that. And so when one reads An American Dilemma, and this is what I meant by he brought sort of like scientific methods to be able to put his study in a frame that was logically consistent, but also covered most of the ground that he needed to cover, but did it also in prose that was very accessible to regular readers. And so he formulated two concepts: the cumulative causation and vicious circles, which fit really well the problem of African Americans living in apartheid in the United States during the early and mid 20th century. The basic idea here is that the way most economists thought back then was, and they still do, was in terms of you think of an economic system as being in an equilibrium. There's a set of forces that are operating somewhat independently, but usually mostly interdependently, and you arrive at some constellation of outcomes. So if it's a whole social system, we can think of one big part of that And the part Myrdal's looking at, of course, as the race relations that are driving how people are interacting in the United States circa 1935, right? And that's an equilibrium. Well, that concept can lead to very conservative ways of thinking about it. If you think that this is an equilibrium system, it's sort of like, you can't change folk ways and mores. People are going to do what they're going to do. Well, if a system is got an equilibrium which is very stable, it's hard to change it. Well, Myrdal's concept of the cumulative causation honed in on the fact that all the various parts of this system are interdependent. Now, that's not something that's a big deal to us today because that's the way we think. But back then, people who were particularly economists would write down an equation, they might write one. But he's thinking in terms of a whole system of equations, and they're all interlocking and looping, so that when you make a change in one place in this system, it feeds through the entire system and can also feed back. Now, that's where the idea of vicious circles comes from, because African Americans were sitting in a very negative position. So what accumulates in this causation? Bad things, right? So bad things maybe even have exponential effects if you push on one part of the system, and it feeds back, and their situation just gets locked into a bad place. But the idea of so that's the vicious circle. But the idea of cumulative causation was Myrdal wasn't looking at a simple equilibrium system that was stable entirely. You could push on one section of the whole system, such as people's beliefs about how Black people ought to be treated, and whether or not how Black people are being treated is consistent with who America is and who they think they are. And if you push on that in the proper way, you can push the system off in a direction where it wasn't before, and it accumulates and leads to a causal process. So Myrdal's way of looking at this problem, therefore, also allowed not simply for conservative stability, but liberal or even leftist, if you like, possibilities of significant change and maybe even revolution. Now, Myrdal would later, and I'm ending in a few seconds, Myrdal would later use those same two concepts in his formulation of underdeveloped countries and what kinds of policies and advice he would put forward in his multi-volume study, Asian Drama, for which he won a Nobel Prize in economics. I think that's the introduction to Myrdal in the United States I'd start out with.
Thank you, Professor Jaynes. And I will say that I don't know if that was a dig in the beginning to say the young people are anti.
You qualify for that.
But I'm turning 40 this year and I will take it, even if it was an insult in some way.
Not an insult.
Okay, so by the way, I should have said my name too. I'm Maribel Morey. And I will start on my own journey with Myrdal. I was living in Paris in 2002, which is about 19 years ago, and understanding the race-sex analogy. So I'm Cuban and trying to understand my own racialized identity and my gendered identity and how they related. And it was always the dichotomy, right? Like it was the binary, I mean. And it's something that Simone de Beauvoir wrote about. Interestingly enough, she was inspired by Gunnar Myrdal's book, An American Dilemma, to expand upon the race-sex analogy. I can tell you a whole story about Kearney Corporation. That was one of the stickiest parts of the book that they asked him to relegate outside of the main manuscript. And Simone de Beauvoir picked up on it from the appendix, and it made it, it made it into, not into, but it inspired her very much for Le Deuxième Sexe. So I got very interested in how did this guy inspire all these people that I thought they were the really smart ones, the geniuses. It was very odd to me that this white guy would write on, racial equality. It would be as weird to me as, a guy, any kind of guy, writing a book on gender equity and being celebrated for it. So I was very intrigued with the whole story about it. So I started over time getting into the archives of the funders. I didn't even know what these foundations were. I thought, okay, being Cuban and growing up Cuban, I understand communism and I understand maximal profit maximization. But who are these people who live in a capitalist society but are supposed to do good, but not equalize things to the point of a communist regime? So what is this? Who are these people who exist in this like middle ground? So trying to understand their psyches, why they would support this project. So that led me to years in the archives. My methods are basically, I start out first with board minutes, annual reports, and then I dig into the correspondence of the main actors in the foundations, and then I trace it and lead into their the networks of grantees. So that's the sort of the structure for the research behind my forthcoming book on an American dilemma. Now, Professor Jaynes brings up a really good point, which is many good points, but one of them being, all right, there's a role that an American dilemma plays. Like it's a really useful tool, especially, you know, considering that the dominant group in the US are white Anglo-Americans. It's kind of helpful to have a white guy whom they would respect and listen to, say things that could help a subordinated group. You know, there's a linguistic power to that. And that's, yes, there's a role that an American dilemma plays in this discursive dialogue with between Black and white Americans to convince, like you mentioned, to convince white Americans to, you know, just be less violent, aggressive, whatever it might be. In that way, it was similar to a book that Kearney Corporation financed right before An American Dilemma, and to which An American Dilemma was modeled after. They wanted to bring this model from British Africa to the US. And that book is called An African Survey, Lord Haley's African Survey, published in 1938. In many ways, it served a similar linguistic or dialectical tool in imperial Africa right at the end of World War II and the post-World War II era, which was similar to what you were mentioning for the dominant imperial group, white Europeans, to be a little bit less, you know, violent, dominant, anti-Black. So if we look at an American, I'm willing to say, yes, let's look at an American dilemma much as an African survey in the imperial African context. So let me just give a little background to the book. So in this section of my presentation, I will talk a bit about my forthcoming book called White Philanthropy, Kearney Corporations, An American Dilemma, and the Making of a White World Order. Again, it's coming out in October. Not easy to write a book that's critical of such a monumental book, let alone a very elite foundation. So it's quite the feat, at least personally. All right, so Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma was a monumental study of the US civil rights movement. It was, again, it was useful, cited by the US Supreme Court in Brown, cited by Truman's Civil Rights Commission. It was a useful tool, outlining various forms of anti-Black discrimination in the country and advocating Black Americans, discrimination in the country and advocating Black Americans' assimilation into white American life. Interestingly enough, it was commissioned and financed by Kearney Corporation of New York, a foundation established by Gilded Age titan Andrew Carnegie in 1911. While acknowledging An American Dilemma's central role in US civil rights discourse, I confirm with historical evidence what Black nationalists and leftist critics had suspected. An American Dilemma never was commissioned, funded, or written with the goal of deeply challenging white supremacy. It was commissioned by then Kearney Corporation President Frederick Keppel and researched and written by Myrdal, precisely with the intent of solidifying white rule over Black people in the US. I detail the complex origins of An American Dilemma, illustrating how the book was part of Kearney Corporation's efforts to finance social science studies that would help white policymakers in the Anglo-American world address perceived problems in their governance of Black people. I also unpack the text itself, arguing that Myrdal ultimately complemented his funders' intentions for the project by keeping white Americans as his principal audience and guiding them towards a national policy program on Black Americans that would keep intact white domination. Because for Myrdal, as Kearney Corporation, international order rested on white Anglo-Americans' continued ability to dominate effectively. So the story in a nutshell, how it starts is, if you want to think even where it really starts, but starts with Frederick Keppel in 1925. He's talking with an advisor, J.H. Oldham, who's part of the missionary networks in London and also becoming quite close to the British Colonial Office. And one anxiety they have is losing the colonies in Africa. They're anxious that the British Empire is going to fall apart. They're already losing India, and what could they do in Africa? And to some extent, the educational model that they were exporting, the Tuskegee educational model, could go so far, but they wanted just one extra tool, and they were intrigued by the potential of social science research. What was social science research? It depended on the person, but scientific research, data collection to help administrators better govern. And that really resonated with Frederick Keppel at a personal level. He had an anxiety about a potential international war along the color line. And I give context to that from his experience in World War I. It also fit well with the Kearney Corporation's mission within the US and beyond. So Andrew Carnegie had passed away by then, but one of his personal secretaries was still on the board, and he was the voice and the intention of the donor's intent at Kearney Corporation. And for him, Andrew Carnegie had intended to particularly help white Anglo-Americans throughout the Anglo-American world. So that's why in the charter of the Kearney Corporation, they were allowed at the time to fund projects in the US, Canada, and the British colonies. All these debates on what the British colonies meant. Guess what? It included Australia. It included South Africa, which was not a colony, it was a commonwealth, right? But it excluded certain colonies that they considered were not sufficiently white or could not have sufficient amount of white settlers. Because as his interpreter said, Andrew Carnegie meant colonies of white people. And if they did fund projects for non-white people, it was in order to help white people govern in the area. So that is the organization that Keppel inherited. And Keppel's own anxieties about helping white policymakers blended well, even if he was going beyond Andrew Carnegie's intentions that, Andrew Carnegie specifically financed education as the panacea for white Anglo-American domination of Black people, but it was still in line with the purpose and the intended audience for Carnegie grants. So in his relationships with Oldham, they fund the first project in South Africa, which is the Poor White Study. And the next, which is the problem there was the anxiety about poverty amongst white people, which for Keppel and his networks in South Africa meant that it was destabilizing racial hierarchy, white supremacy and Black subordination. So how to solve that problem. And that was that first study. For different reasons, I can go into more detail. The next study isn't in South Africa, but based out of Chatham House in London. And the anxiety there is just generally Imperial Africa. And their solution was to share knowledge across empires in Africa. If they only shared knowledge, this was the idea at Chatham House, then this would help solidify white rule across the continent and would help all the different European powers maintain control. Well, Keppel was enamored completely with this model of a study. So unlike the Poor White Study, this was directed by someone with administrative experience, a colonial officer, Lord Haley. And it was a cooperative study, but unlike the ones that he had seen in the SSRC, like recent social trends or the Poor White Study, it was not that each researcher was providing us a chapter or a different volume separately written. In fact, it would be under the director's vision that the entire report would be to his credit. And the collaborators were generally invisible. So you just had the team of people helping this one person who would be responsible for the whole report. And he was already someone with experience translating data collection to policy making. So with that model, he's thinking when Keppel has opportunity to change the funding pattern in the US, this is a model he has in mind. And so the vision was that you would help that Myrdal, and I can go in more detail later on why him and not a straight up colonial officer, even though it's still a white man from Europe with public policy experience and planning a national policy program. His agenda was to help white policymakers across the US synthesize into a national policy program an approach to race, to Black Americans. From our perspective as 21st century people, we might sometimes think that a national approach is more progressive, but if you actually see it from this perspective of a continuation of an African survey, it was actually just another form of colonial administration. So now Gunnar Myrdal himself was not part of these imperial networks, though he was selected by Keppel for these administrative experiences in Sweden, which I'm sure Michael will go into more detail too about his background there. Even more, he was very much in dialogue with Keppel. Keppel selected an office walking distance from him in New York. He read drafts. Before that, he was very much into the nitty gritty. Like he got updates every few days on what was happening with the project. And he read drafts of the chapters when Myrdal wrote them and gave feedback, and there was a response to it. But beyond that, Myrdal also just was in sync with the idea that international order rested on white Anglo-American domination. That was just a given. And that was only heightened for him during World War II when he was finishing the manuscript. He felt an anxiety and a pressure to make sure that this project helped Americans maintain domination, looking good within a national context and then globally. So the manuscript he produced was very much in sync with the corporation's intentions for it. The only disagreement they had, the major one, was that Myrdal dismissed the utility or the necessity of Southern white people for a national program. He thought you can bypass them because they were divided and they didn't even have that much power during the New Deal. So he thought that the Northern white people were the most important and powerful, and they could really expedite this program. So ultimately, you see some limitations in Myrdal's thinking about equality at the global level. As I can talk about later and will, there's assumptions about the folk, what and the national community needs to look like, but also a deep assumption about the value of continued white Anglo-American leadership, domination as key for international order. I'll leave it to you, Michael.
Thank you, Maribel. And yes, and thank you also, Professor Jaynes, for your insights on the American dilemma. My perspective on Gunnar Myrdal and also his wife, Alva Myrdal, is very much informed by the fact that I was born and grew up here in Sweden and under social democracy. And, I'm quite familiar with what social democracy has meant to Sweden in practice, and also how Gunnar and Alva Myrdal both contributed to the development of social democracy, how their intellectual work and their political practice was also informed by social democracy. And the two of them are among, if not the premier ideological or the premier ideologues of Swedish social democracy, especially after World War II, but even before that. And maybe their breakthrough was in the 1930s with a book called the Kris i befolkningsfrågan, which was translated, I believe, and published in English 1941 as The Nation and Family. And that book was very much in the 1930s, was very much about the nation and the family, and the interrelationship between the nation and the family, and also an implicit understanding of the nation as an extended family, which was very much the concept of the nation at the time, and which is embedded, among other things, in a term that was very popular at the time, a social democratic term where the nation is described as a people's home, Folkhemmet. And the 1930s and that book from 1934 should also be seen against the background of eugenics programs in Sweden at the time. 1922, the Swedish parliament established with overwhelming majority a state institute for the study of race biology, and the mandate of that institute was to study the race biology of the Swedish nation and to find ways of improving the race biology of the Swedish nation. So it was a eugenics institute. Basically, it was actually the world's first state-run eugenics institute. And that was very much in vogue during the 1930s, and Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, they were influenced by these sorts of trends at the time. However, now what, I am very sympathetic, of course, to what the American dilemma has meant in a US context. And, as Professor Jaynes pointed out, it was an effective rhetorical and persuasive piece of work that was meant to address white people, and especially the southern part of the US. And so, that can maybe also be used to defend the fact that Black scholars are marginalized, and, or, not to say maybe almost non-existent, and the contributions to American dilemma is not showcased in the work, and including what Professor Jaynes brought up about the vicious circle, which is one of the key arguments of the American dilemma, the idea that the social ills of African Americans are due to segregation and not any innate racial qualities. And of course, this was also a key argument of Du Bois, the Philadelphia Negro from 1899, although that is not recognized in American dilemma. Now, my view on and how I understand the American dilemma, I put American dilemma also, in a Swedish context, and in a context of Gunnar Myrdal and Alva Myrdal's other work, and also in the context of social democracy, both domestically and Swedish social democracy domestically and internationally. And there are a lot of virtues. Gunnar and Alva Myrdal bring a lot of intellectual virtues to social democracy, to understanding issues of race in the US, to issues of global development, the impact of colonialism, and so forth. And among their virtues is perhaps also that they want to ground all their work from or on a basic moral view of humanity, and it is a sort of Enlightenment ideal that society should be based on a respect for the equal moral worth of people. And as Gunnar Myrdal thought about his economy, his economic theory, he thought economists should be explicit with these sorts of grounding philosophies. And his was very much one of egalitarianism. And this was also the case of Alva Myrdal. And so the American creed, as is spoken of in the American dilemma, is as much a social democratic creed for the Myrdals, but for the Myrdals, the social democratic creed had a progressive welfare state twist to it, to ensure that the protection of the poorest and least powerful in society and the realization of equality, equal opportunities, and freedom are available for all. So they would put greater emphasis on the welfare state than you would do in a US context. And Alva Myrdal, she gave a lecture, I think it was in the late 1960s as a social democratic convention, where she urged her fellow social democrats to be consequential in their egalitarianism, and that respect for equality at home must be reflected in respect for equality in foreign affairs. And this sort of ideology, if you will, and sort of internationalist ideology based on an international solidarity, this was very much the ethos of social democracy after Swedish social democracy after World War II. However, it also came with some serious limitations, and these limitations are very much, they very much reverberate in Swedish society today. And so I think it's fair to describe Swedish social democracy and the social democracy of Gunnar and Alva Myrdal as a sort of form of racial social democracy. But, why and what is meant by that, maybe we can discuss that a little later.
I can jump in here. Now we're going to go into our next topic of the Myrdals, the folk, racial liberalism, and racial social democracy. And if you don't mind, I think that I'll just springboard from the Swedish context. Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I was just going to mention that just Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, and Michael was already mentioning it, they published Kris i befolkningsfrågan, Crisis in the Population Question, in 1934. And as Michael also mentioned, she translated for a US audience this experience in 1941. It was part of their deal when Gunnar Myrdal came over to the US that she would have an opportunity to translate this very famous book into English. And it was published by the same press that published An American Dilemma, Harper and Brothers. So they were both Rockefeller Fellows in 1929 to 30. So you imagine you're a foundation fellow. These fellowships were created in order by the Rockefeller groups in order to expose European scholars to the growing fields of the social sciences in the US, because their vision was that World War I had really stagnated this transatlantic exchange. And also, if you only expose white European social scientists to these fields and help them apply it to public policy making, you could avoid a second World War. That was like the hope. Much like in that context, it was a second World War. In the colonial African context, it was basically a rising Black consciousness, avoiding it, placating it. Okay, so they go to the US 1929 to 30. They get back ultimately after a stint in Geneva. They get to Stockholm, and they co-author this book, which really unites their different specialties, his in economics, hers in psychology. And they're responding to anxieties about population decline across continental Europe after World War I. You can imagine the French and the German fighting out in trenches, losing a lot of men, and like, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? We don't have any men to reproduce. Our culture is going to be that much more vulnerable. We don't want the French to invade, the Germans don't, vice versa. If we don't have enough people, we're going to go down. Then also economically, the different theories. So you have like Malthusian saying that you need a certain amount of a population because you need to balance it with the resources available. So what is the ideal number of people in a country? And how do you promote reproduction? And so all these different countries in Europe are having these debates in the 20s. Sweden was not a belligerent state in World War I, but they're still engaged with it. They're like, you know what? We actually do have a problem in Sweden. We don't have as many people reproducing. And by the way, these are the Myrdal speaking. We do not consider immigration a solution to this because we want Swedes, like, the ones who eat cinnamon rolls. I'm kidding, Michael, but meatballs and Swedish and cinnamon rolls. So how do we get these Swedes to reproduce? And they're saying, well, they're already modern. They're modern couples in Stockholm, the roaring 20s, like, women want to go to work. So we're not going to invade that. We want to promote that. We don't want to be the version of France or Germany, you know, where you just have women having tons of babies and they can never enjoy modern life. So that's the beginning of the welfare state for some, you know, like the idea that you can promote reproduction if you provide care, if you provide prenatal care, if you provide education. So you basically control the costs of parenting. Then you might have people and the burdens of parenting. Then you might convince more of these modern couples to reproduce. So, and then in this conversation, they discussed too the quality of the population. And they said, you know what, we don't have to worry, you know, like we know what's going on. We're publishing this book in 1934. 1933 is Hitler and Third Reich in Germany. Like we know the conversations they're having there about population quality, and we don't have to go there. There's different types. Poor Swedes are just as likely to produce quality children as more affluent Swedes. And this is like, they're using social scientific knowledge from the US that they had been exposed to. You know, you imagine Franz Boas, W.I. Thomas, that they were comparing white ethnic people and saying the differences you see amongst white ethnics is actually created by environment, not biology. Because, you know, we've seen in other contexts from the US and Britain that if you change their environment, these different people that you thought were biologically inferior, you know, because poor people seem to have lower IQs in the tests we see them, or like they don't, why don't they ever contain wealth? There must be something biologically wrong with them. And the Myrdals are saying, no, this literature is showing you that it's actually the environment. Like if you change people's education, their general environmental structures, they will attain the same things as like the metric, the people that you consider to be like the role models. And so they encourage, you know, poorer Swedes to reproduce at the same level. And they say if poorer Swedes were treated the same, they could assimilate into the folk. All right, so that's the folk as being one national community. In a similar way, they analogize it, they use the terms Jews in Poland and Black Americans in the US. If you just change the environment, these different groups could assimilate. So there's no reason to kill groups, they can actually assimilate. So from that perspective, it's like, it's a bit progressive, right? From another perspective, it's saying the definition of a nation is a folk. And in order to, the only version of it's either being killed or assimilate into the dominant group. So this definition of the folk gets into an American dilemma. The assumption is that there's only one folk in the US and it's dominant white Americans. And the definition of equality means assimilation into it, the erasure of absolute anything that makes you different from that dominant folk. And we should be willing to do that. Like me as a Cuban American, I should be willing to never speak Spanish again. Anything that I value in my culture, as far as the definition of equality. Another thing that came into it was the Myrdals' sense of understanding the group psychology. So much as they were trying to understand modern couples in Sweden and how they would think and what they needed to get the policy results that the Myrdals wanted, in an American Dilemma, they applied the same thing. They're like, okay, my target audience is actually white Northerners and New Dealers. That's my audience. I don't care, actually, I would distinguish myself from Professor Jaynes. They didn't care too much about white Southerners. Like they were, you know, Myrdal was ready to.
I said what you just said.
Okay, you would agree?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right, there we go.
Said they're not going to change recalcitrant segregationists.
Yeah, so for him, it was irrelevant. That was an issue for Keppel, President Keppel. So by the way, in the introduction, in the preface to the book, Keppel said, I apologize, readers. Myrdal, this is his second language. So if you see any infelicities with his language, i.e. about white Southerners, it was just, you know, lost in translation. So anyway, the group psychology was targeting that was the main audience. So how do white Northerners like to see themselves? As egalitarian people, as people who are trying to meet their egalitarian ideals. And so speaking in that language to get them to achieve the goals he wanted. But again, those goals, as I would argue, was about making those white Americans look good, both nationally and internationally, because that was really important for Gunnar Myrdal in 1944. So you guys do you want to continue, Michael, talking about your sense of racial social democracy? And then, or maybe we can bring in Professor Jaynes, because it's been a while.
Well, yeah, I think I can agree with almost everything that's been said up to this point, but I'd like to draw an analogy. First, I have no doubts Keppel of the Carnegie Corporation thought white people were superior to everybody else on the planet. I would even stipulate that probably 99% of white people thought white people were superior to everyone else on the planet. And that's where I want to bring my analogy in, because I want to say, okay, if that's the situation and white people have all the power, what do we do to move forward to try to get in Du Boisian terms to that day way off sometime in the future when there's going to be this mutual recognition between all peoples? Because it's not going to happen in 1944. Now, here's the analogy I want to draw. I want to draw an analogy between the relationship between William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and Oswald Garrison and Du Bois. William Lloyd Garrison, I hope we all know, the leader of the abolitionists, the radical abolitionists, end slavery in the 19th century, 1830s, 40s. Nobody has doubted his sincerity at ending slavery. Does that mean people think William Lloyd Garrison thought blacks or Africans were equal? No. He believed white people were superior. Does that mean we want to, what do we want to do with that? Because the Garrisonians, as they were called, were important participants
Professor Jaynes, I think your Wi-Fi. Is it? Does everyone else agree or no?
started.
Okay. We lost you for the last 20 seconds.
So all I was saying was, did you hear me when I was talking about Garrison believed in white superiority?
No, yeah, I think.
Okay. Garrison was the leader of radical abolitionism, but he also believed in white superiority. No way he was thinking we're going to end slavery and black people are going to become equals throughout society. And it won't be the case that 50 years later or 100 years later, white people won't still be in control of the world. That's not the way they were thinking. But does that mean that we want to disavow or not take advantage of the existence of white liberal thinkers along those lines who are existing in a given historical context? Now I'll bring it up. Oswald Garrison, a descendant. He was one of the founders of the NAACP at the Niagara movement. Had a relationship with Du Bois, one of jealousy, just like Garrison with Frederick Douglass, because they were dealing with black men who were more talented than they were. And it's the same thing. Oswald Garrison put a lot of money into the NAACP. And he played an important major role in that long civil rights movement that's taking us to the 50s, 60s, etc. But same thing I said about William Lloyd, he still believed he thought he was superior to Du Bois. He thought white people were superior to blacks. Now, Myrdal, no doubt, thought white people were superior too, although I probably would put him in a slightly different urn, if you will, than either the two Garrisons with respect to their racial beliefs. The fact that they had those beliefs is not what I'd focus on when I'm trying to understand what role they played and what role their works played in the development of our current world as far as it goes with respect to race relations and inter-country national relations around the globe. okay? And so one last point on this same thing, as I started with saying, I don't doubt Keppel had these beliefs. I'm not going by what Keppel might have been thinking. I'm going by 50 years of study of the text and the fact that reading the text tells me Du Bois, Ralph Bunche, and a bunch of other scholars upon whom Myrdal was drawing play a much more important role in that text than Keppel does. Now, I guess I should say one other thing. However, I will agree. There's exactly that point. And what Maribel is saying about white domination and the worldview that these people, including the Myrdals, had in their heads, it does come down to that whole idea of assimilation. I'm sure they never gave second thought to a critique of that model, that obviously everybody else should be trying to assimilate to white people, wherever they might be on our globe. And that is precisely the criticism that Ralph Ellison made of American Dilemma in the essay, which was supposed to, a review of the book, which was supposed to appear in the Antioch Review, but didn't, I guess because it was too negative. But his major criticism was, and I'll paraphrase here, it always struck me with obviously Ellison's great proclivity to do prose, that out of all the generations of African Americans who had existed in North America, wasn't there one thing any one of them might have done that was independent of white people and contributed to the American story? So that's his criticism, because he's saying that essentially Myrdal is doing just what Maribel just said. He's downplaying anything that might have Blacks independent of and different from whites that might undermine the assimilation argument. Okay, so we'll grant all that, but I just simply say that's where the world was in 1944.
Okay, so I'll have a follow-up question here. So how honest then can we be? Because I think there's even pushback to say, you know what, an American Dilemma is just a tool. You know, how honest in a white environment, in a white Anglo-American environment, can one be to say, like, you know what, I'm going to be honest. This is just a tool to talk to you because, you know, this is the way you like to talk. And you'd like to have a really inflated sense of yourself as a really egalitarian person. And you have these assumptions about, you know, your own superiority that I have to meet this, you know, your sense of everything you do being better in order to achieve equality in your eyes. And this has been a really useful tool. How do you see that? Because, yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of building a little bit of a straw person, because whenever I want to persuade somebody, I very rarely say to them, you are stupid and immoral. And I look for what I think, this is how they feel about themselves, this is what they think of themselves and what they would like to think about themselves. And I would try to use that. And I think that's what Myrdal's doing. So I think there's a level of, say, you can put it in a cynical way, and then you can put it in a more articulate, persuasive. You can frame it in either one of those two ways. And I like to do it in the second category. But I understand what you're saying.
Michael, did you want to jump in and tease out? We have several questions in the chat, and just a reminder, we have to finish promptly at 2 in order for our colleagues to have the time on this platform. So maybe you want to describe your argument on racial social democracy if you had other thoughts on that. I can follow up on the American Creed. There's a question on that, and then we'll move it from there because there's another question on women intellectuals. So Go for it.
Okay, yes, so, yes. So what an argument that I would like to make is that the social democracy and much of the intellectual work of Gunnar Myrdal and Alva Myrdal also is based on what might be described as a form of racial social democracy. And you know, I agree with the what has been said previously, and I would like to emphasize here that I'm not, you know, interested in the psychology of Gunnar Myrdal, and I think his view on race and racial superiority was at least deeply ambiguous, keeping in mind, for instance, that Myrdal was among the lead drafters of the first UNESCO statements on race, and you know, which can be described as the official UN stance on the existence or non-existence of biological racism. But of course, there's an implicit assumption throughout his writing. There's an implicit assumption, at least, that Western forms of life and Enlightenment ideals and modernity and Western civilization is superior, and all other forms of society should develop and adopt and modernize, adopt a Western way of life, Enlightenment based, and modernize, and so forth. And this is very much his view on the world, including the US, and this is also something that runs through the American dilemma. And what might be missing in the American dilemma? One of the criticisms against the American dilemma, besides that it, you know, it makes invisible the contributions of Black scholars, and makes it, you know, also puts forth white contributions and so on, maybe more than Black contributions even, but also that it maybe psychologizes too much the issue of race and racism in the US, and it doesn't take seriously enough the more structural aspects of race and how centuries of racism have been institutionalized, not only in the US, but also internationally. And so social democracy can be described as a racial form of racial form of social democracy, much like racial liberalism describes liberalism that is premised on a social contract among white people and which does not recognize, let alone address, issues of racial injustice. Racial social democracy is also premised on a political community of white people and does not recognize, let alone address, its own complicity with racial injustices, and does not include structural issues of racial injustice. One can say that there are at least three aspects to this racial social democracy, which we find in the Myrdals and others. First aspect is to assume, while not taking responsibility for nor addressing, that Sweden is a people's home for white people. So that is one background assumption. Second is to promote one society, Sweden in this case, as a good white society, a good white social democratic society, which, unlike other white societies such as the US and Britain, does not or do not have any entrenched histories of racism and colonialism. And third, to fail to see how centuries of colonialism has entrenched international structures of racial inequity and injustices and discrimination, and how one's own white European country, that is Sweden, is deeply embedded in these structures. And this is very much the case if one studies, I think, both Alva and Gunnar Myrdal and their work from especially the 1950s, when their work takes an international turn, which is also in line very much with the development domestically of social democracy, where social democracy in Sweden after World War II, when the atrocities of the Holocaust were uncovered and the enormous destructivity of race and race thinking was sort of, made obvious, Sweden made a turnaround and went from being very much a nation that was explicitly promoting itself as.
Sorry, we only have 4 minutes left, and
oh,
we want.
Sorry. Oh,
Okay.
sorry. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I got a little caught up here.
It's okay. No. We just want to give some.
Okay. All right. Sure. So I will just end here. I hope people get the gist of the perspective. Yes. Thank you.
So Stephanie, you're right there. You had a really great question. I was going to approach it. Did you want to add anything to it or no? Okay. So you asked about the idea central to the American creed that Myrdal argues leaves Black people out of human rights. So just a quick, I'm going to do it in 1 minute. Okay. So, so the first time I see an American creed mentioned in their work, it's actually a co-authored book by Gunnar and Alva Myrdal called Kontakt med Amerika. They published this book during a little hiatus from the project. They went back to Sweden during the war, thinking that the country needed them. Didn't need to do a lot of service in the moment. So they thought they should do this wartime service of a book. And in the book, they start distinguishing for their fellow citizens in Sweden, Americans from Germans. They're like, yeah, we get it. If you look at it on paper, you might think, what's the point of fighting, a potential Third Reich invasion? We are invaded on either side, with Finland and Norway and Denmark, we're all, so why should we hold out? I know, I get it. You think it's, the Americans are the same as Germans because the Germans are discriminating against Jews, actually killing Jews, or sending them to camps. And then ultimately genocide. And then similarly in the US, white Americans are committing genocide on Black Americans, all right? So on paper, they kind of look at morally comparable people. But you don't know, I've met the Americans, and in their hearts, unlike the Germans, they want to be better people. And that's called the American creed. It's like something in their souls, and they have this real propensity towards equality and freedom for all. So even if their behavior, they're not living up to it, they really feel guilty about it and they want to do better.
Well,
yeah.
He took that from de Tocqueville.
Yeah, I would say it had a very big wartime role for him. And then they injected into an American dilemma as a way, the world is watching. They know the world is watching. They want the world to watch what the US is doing. So anyway, I'll move on. And then a question for somebody else. You see something, Professor Jaynes, you'd like to respond to? Oh, this is a great one too. So Caroline, I responded to yours, I hope, and we can talk more. Robin has a question. Professor Turner, is there a text that has the structures of racial social democracy?
Yes, maybe I can answer that. So yes, there's no text that elaborates.
That you have written up, actually.
Sorry?
That you have written. Have you written specifically on racial social democracy? And we have.
No, I haven't written anything. I haven't elaborated on that concept. Although I have written quite a lot of stuff that makes it clear that racial structures are a part of the Swedish social democracy and the Swedish welfare state. Universal human rights and the coloniality of race in Sweden is one text like that. And then also several texts in Afro-Nordic landscapes, equality and race in Northern Europe. Yep.
They might cut us off, I think, but anyone else who wants to speak?
So thanks for the discussion, and maybe we can voluntarily make the deadline before they cut us off.
Oh, like cut ourselves off.
Yeah, because we're inside, it's 2 o'clock.
Yeah, okay. All right. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.